I am Annie Fett-Cruz, Director of the Blessed Tomorrow program at ecoAmerica. And while we're all tuning in virtually, I am hosting from Vienna, Virginia, which I honor as the ancestral home of the Manahoic people. I'm excited to welcome you, and I extend you peace and my gratitude for joining us today. Today's Let's Talk Climate episode is called Act Now, 5 Ways You Can Make a Difference on Climate as a Matter of Faith. And we're talking to local faith organizations who are successfully implementing climate policy and increasing climate action in their communities. And they want to help you do so as well. But before I introduce them, I wanted to share some helpful context in an opening segment we're calling Climate Quick Take. So first, faith communities around the world are becoming more vocal and visible on climate change, elevating it as a moral issue. It's really incredible to see so many faith leaders and other faith institutions who have signed on to our coalition's momentous statement, which calls for ambitious climate solutions that halve carbon emissions each decade going forward. Another great example happened just 2 weeks ago on March 11th, as people of faith and faith institutions around the world joined the Sacred Earth, Sacred People Day of Action. This was coordinated by Green Faith International as a unified day of action co-sponsored by 120 religious groups, representing more than 100 million people, and held over 400 actions worldwide. Another example, our friends with Interfaith Power and Light, who have 40 state chapters nationwide, will host their annual Faith Climate Action Week in April and work to connect food, faith, and climate this year with local action and advocacy activities. Yet another example, this year's Ecumenical Advocacy Days, beginning April 18th, it's the annual advocacy conference for most Christian traditions in the US and is entirely focused on climate and environmental justice this year. So of course, there are many other examples. I think the bottom line here is that people of faith are doing a lot. And I want to say thank you to anyone listening who is leading or participating or supporting this work. Second, we know there is a real urgency to increasing action right now. Let me just share an article in The Guardian 2 weeks ago titled "The Race to Zero, Can America Reach Net Zero Emissions by 2050?" which highlights both the urgency in reducing carbon emissions to prevent worst case scenarios, but it also really highlights the urgency in adopting policies that are needed to do that. There's a lot to do, and we don't have a lot of time. But really, we know the faith sector must lead in this work. Our voices are important. And ultimately, finally here, the rubber meets the road locally. Sustained local action and advocacy can make a real difference and provide success stories for other communities, for you to share with federal policymakers, state and local policymakers in their own attempts to pass and implement climate solutions. And again, the good news is that faith communities, like our guests today, want to share and see their success replicated around the country. So we're doing a lot, we can do more. I want to bring my guests in to weigh in on this. So let me introduce them. We're honored to welcome Meg Mall, who is Executive Director of the Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions in Fairfax County, Virginia, and Jeff Levy-Lyons, Steering Committee Member for the Jewish Climate Action Network of New York. So hello, and thanks so much for being here. It's so nice to have you.
It's great to be here with you, Annie and Meg and all of your viewers.
Great. So let's dive in. Just to start us off and kind of responding to some of what I shared, I wanted to ask you both to share briefly kind of what personally motivates you to act on climate as a matter of your own faith, and why have you answered the call to climate action? Let's just start there. So Jeff, you want to start us off?
Sure, Annie. Well, I think callings come in many different forms, and sometimes they're not the call to get involved, but the call to stay clear and on the path. And I had one of those personally 4 years ago after the 2016 election, and the call, as I was steeped in despair and really feeling despondent about the future, the call came from my wife's hand dragging me to a People's Climate Movement meeting in Midtown Manhattan, and that became a very clear moment of, yeah, I think I'm supposed to do this. I heard what I think is a kind of voice from the Holy calling to me, and I can't quote that voice exactly, but it was something to the effect of, I'll let you know when it's time to sit down, and trust me, it's not now. So these voices show up in different ways, and that for me was a sense of a calling that I could not say no to.
Amen. Meg, how about you?
Thanks, Jeff, for sharing. My journey started as a child of the 80s when the ozone layer was first discovered, or the hole in the ozone layer was first discovered. And this has sometimes been referred to as a focusing moment or this time of unprecedented collective action. And also at that time, Earth Day was first celebrated in 1970. So it was still gaining momentum in those days. So for me, it heightened my awareness of personal and collective action for the environment, but I hadn't yet connected that to my faith. And that really came much later. 4 years ago, like Jeff, I joined what became this massive environmental resistance movement, though I really didn't realize at the time how new many of us were to that movement. We were all in it and learning together. There's so many different ways we can act and participate in climate action, which is why we're here talking today. For me, the best fit was to connect my passion with my faith. Before this, to be honest, I hadn't really found my voice. I wasn't a scientist. I didn't feel like a natural activist. So um, for me to fall back on my faith and connect my climate activism to this care for Earth and all living things, to value life, that's what felt comfortable. So I find that it can be easy to get bogged down into facts and data, tactics, which are all important, but I am able to recenter when I bring it back to my faith. So I'm so thankful to be joined by all these other great people in the faith community that are also working at it from this angle.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. It resonates with me personally. And interestingly enough, I came to this about 4 years ago where I was finally able to kind of marry my passion for the health impacts of climate with my faith and the fact that my faith tradition was finally becoming more publicly visible on this issue. But Meg, let's talk a little bit more about the organization that you run, and maybe you can help us understand what really gives faith communities, the congregations that you work with at Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions, such a powerful voice with local leaders, and why was FACS originally founded?
Sure, thank you, Annie. When the faith community meets with local elected officials, we are coming to them as constituents, but also as a member of a Catholic parish or a local synagogue or a mosque. We are not coming to them as Democrats or Republicans. And when FACS meets with local elected officials, we always introduce ourselves by identifying our faith tradition. What we found that when we approach our leaders from a position of faith, it can often disarm them and really open the door and create a space for a productive dialogue about a subject that is frequently incorrectly labeled as partisan. So FACS was formed to create opportunities for people to act together on their values, their moral, their spiritual, their religious beliefs. The faith community has this ability to organize large numbers of people that might not otherwise participate in advocacy, which makes it this really important, critical asset to climate justice. And besides that, many people just aren't aware of the decisions that are made at the local level that impact climate policies, which is really where the effects of climate change are felt most keenly. So we found that persistent and local advocacy that is grounded in morality is how we make an impact.
And Jeff, what about the Jewish Climate Action Network of New York? Why was it important to have an organized Jewish platform in New York City to advocate in your community?
Well, very practical terms, the Jewish community represents 13% of the total population of New York, which is over 8 million people. So that's a big number. In fact, it's the largest Jewish community outside of Israel in the world. So a natural constituency to want to bring into this work seemed to us at JCAN that the Jewish voice was more muted than it ought to be.
Hmm.
And so JCAN set about as its mission to provide invitations and pathways to more and more people to get involved in more and more kinds of work, depending on their interests, their skills, their passions. And I had done a lot of work in the secular climate movement, always gravitating towards gathering the faith, the multi-faith communities into that work. But I felt most comfortable because of my teachings, my traditions, and the way that they supported me to be doing this within a faith context and within my own Jewish community.
Hmm. Well, so just maybe to you both, with the really powerful work that you're both doing, how has using spiritual teaching really helped people build their awareness and agency on climate? I'm wondering if you've seen those spiritual teachings kind of move people from just being concerned to actually doing something, and maybe give us some examples of some of those transformations.
Well, I could speak to that. And in your introduction, Annie, you mentioned the March 11th Faith Day of Action, with all of those events going around, 400 events around the world. Here in New York City, JCAN, Jewish Climate Action Network, convened a day of action that was within the Jewish community that brought together 5 rabbis, 1 cantor, blessings, sacred music, reading of Torah, really just to steep those attendees in our traditions as a way to lift us up and inspire us. And then right in the middle of that event, we did a phone banking to our representatives in Albany, the state capital, in support of a critical piece of legislation. And people, even those who had done a lot of that kind of phone banking in the past, reported that doing it in the midst of all of that sort of irrigating energy that that our faith and our traditions and our scriptures can give us, they felt more empowered, more grounded, more connected, more inspired. And so it really had the effect that we hoped it would have. And it's something that we would look to replicate. So I think the connective tissue is there if we remember to look for it, or if it's offered to us.
Hmm. Well, thank you for offering it. Meg, how about you?
Sure. Well, the connection between caring for the earth and spiritual teaching has really long been established in all faith traditions. And there's this sense of this moral obligation to preserve what was given to us, and to the next generation, and to give to the next generation an earth that is at least as beautiful and sustaining as how we inherited it. But what I find really encouraging is the shift over this past year, well, a few years, but especially in this past year, to connect climate action with justice. So it's that human connection, understanding how people are impacted by the effects of climate change, and acknowledging that people are not impacted equally. And so, our spiritual teachings tell us that we have to care for one another. So by joining together in community, we can act on our values and through actions, and really make a difference.
Completely agree. I know obviously today we really wanted to provide our audience with some really concrete actions and frame for their own work, mirrored after some of the successes that you both have had. And so I asked you to prepare ahead of time 5 recommendations, 5 actions that you would recommend folks take and why. And so I'm going to have you list those, and then we can talk about them and see if the audience has some questions to dive into as well. So Meg, why don't you start, and then we'll go to Jeff.
Sure. Thanks, Annie. The first one I'm going to say is to talk. And that may not sound concrete. In fact, it sounds completely abstract, but just bear with me a moment. The fact is that Americans believe that climate change is happening, but most of us aren't talking about it. And the reason why this is so important is that having conversations is what changes our culture and ultimately changes our actions at the individual, community, and organizational level. So we don't have these conversations because maybe we're uncomfortable or we don't know where to start. And there's really a lot of good information and research out there about what is effective. But when it comes down to it, what is effective is just the basic principles behind having a conversation with anyone. And that's not to shame, not to force your ideas on others, but to be a good listener, be sincere, meet people where they are, find commonalities and start from there. And also understanding what people value. To some, it might be health or economics or justice, or another strategy might be to understand ways in which they're impacted by climate change. So are they suffering from longer periods of sustained seasonal allergies? How are the additional days of extreme heat impacting them, and so forth? Then the second recommendation I have is to act on your values. And really, I want to say first is not to wait and not to be overwhelmed by what can seem like a long list of opportunities. And that's what they are. So we don't have to do them all. I'll just rattle off a few individual actions that I won't go into in detail, but some of the most impactful individual actions can be things like a plant-rich diet, switching to electric vehicles, installing green energy or solar on your home, reducing food waste, flying less, and sharing actions with others. And that last one I think is particularly important. I mean, you can think about the person that bought a Tesla in your neighborhood or installed solar panels, and think about how exciting that was. So, talk about your choices and be an influencer. And then as a faith community, you also have an opportunity to act on your values. FACTS has what we call a Tree of Life program, which is essentially a program that recognizes the eco actions or the green actions of a faith community. So we currently have a challenge for 25 faith communities to participate in our net zero program by benchmarking their carbon footprint in the EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager by Earth Day. This we're doing in partnership with Arizona State University's SEEK program, which pairs faith communities with students to help with that initial benchmark. And by the way, when we say net zero, we mean essentially achieving a balance between the greenhouse gases that are put into the atmosphere by your campus and those taken out, which is typically achieved through a combination of energy efficiency measures and on-site or purchased renewable energy. So I invite you to consider joining our net zero program or something similar, or other actions that we identify in our Tree of Life program. What's important here is leading by example. Third is to join. And we are most impactful when we join with others. So collective action, particularly at the political and consumer levels, is what's needed to decarbonize our Earth. Thankfully, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of organizations that are working at the local, state, and federal level that you can join with. Groups like the Jewish Climate Action Network of New York, Citizens Climate Lobby, Interfaith Power and Light, the Sierra Club, 350.org, and so many others. And of course, FACTS if you're in Northern Virginia. So connect with others as you join and get involved in their campaigns. The fourth is vote. Traditionally, environmentalists are not good at getting out and voting, but you've heard it before, your voice matters. Get to know your candidates and their position on climate and justice issues, and then vote. Lastly is to lead. I've alluded to this in some of my previous recommendations. And what I mean here is the difference between being passively engaged to talking, sharing your actions, taking on leadership roles. And I don't mean that a leadership role has to be major or time consuming, but check with your local organizations about their needs and opportunities. For instance, FACTS is always recruiting people to join our advocacy teams, and faith communities always need people to participate and lead on their green teams. So we really need everyone to be in on this. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Lots of options, and I hope folks are hearing the call to action here. Or if you already are on some level of that spectrum that Meg shared, that you're finding, okay, well, where can I lean in a little more? And just reiterating that we're not alone in this work. Jeff, how about you?
Sure. And I would say amen to everything that Meg just listed. Lots of overlap with the list that I'm going to provide as well. The first one, and it's similar to speaking out, it is acting like it's an emergency. I think there's a lot of movement around recognizing that, look, if I look out my window, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, aside from everybody wearing a mask, which is still very important, people are going about their day, and you would not know that we're facing an existential crisis, but we are. And so speaking out, as Meg suggested, and speaking, certainly being willing to listen a lot to other people's perspectives, but sharing yourself in the most personal terms, I think is important. Talking about your own fears for your own family, your fears for your descendants, issues of justice and equity being something that matter deeply to you, caring for wildlife, caring for sacred creation, to speak in religious terms. When we start to talk about things and do it with, as Meg said, not to be shaming, but I call it a bold humility, like to be willing to be vulnerable without being aggressive. And that serves as both inspiration and invitation to have people join the work. Second, I would say there are all kinds of personal actions that people can take. And of course, statistically, any one of them that any one of us would do would be virtually insignificant, except that when we create a ripple that then builds out, then it starts to really make waves, right? So take a bold personal action. I recently heard about an action from Katherine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist at Texas Tech. She, who's been in this work for a long time, only fairly recently realized that she had credit cards who were associated with banks that were fueling fossil fund infrastructure. She was appalled by it. So she took the following steps. She canceled the cards. She called the customer service people and explained to them why she was canceling the cards. She called the credit cards sustainability office and told them why she was canceling the cards and suggested they might want to affiliate with different institutions. And then she told everybody. That's how I heard about it. And I'm inspired, and other people inspired. That one action by one individual can create enormous rippling behaviors. It's not that we shouldn't take the individual actions that are smaller, because I believe they give us a higher and higher moral platform to do right living as our faith traditions teach us. But when we find the bigger actions individually that can ripple out, then we're more powerful. Okay? My third suggestion is to take nourishment from your spiritual tradition. I explained how we operate in our event on March 11th. And I think anytime we can go back to the obvious places, and maybe even some of the subtle places in our traditions, in our scriptures, across all religions, they're all there. They're all telling us to do what is right by creation. We are both held accountable, but more importantly, we're held up by those. We're given power by those. And so I think it's important to really take advantage of our faith as a support tool and inspiration. Fourth, and this is a bit of overlap with also something that Meg said, to make sure what you're doing brings your best skills and your best passions. You can think about it as a Venn diagram with three circles. One circle is what's the work that needs to be done. Second circle is what skills and gifts do you have? And the third one is what brings you passion. So I want to give you a short list going from the most obvious to the least obvious things that you might have and not think to deploy on behalf of climate work. So more obvious to less obvious. You're a good speaker. You're a good writer. You're a meeting event planner. You're a good meeting facilitator. You're a social media expert. You're a graphic designer, an artist, a dancer, a musician, a social connector. If these are skills that you already deploy in some area of your life, redeploy them. We need it all. And fifth, Meg said vote. I want to underscore that, say amen, vote. But I would also encourage people to do election work. I want to say this in the most nonpartisan way that I can, but a huge intersectional area is voter suppression, because voter suppression is both flat out injustice, and it's also true that the majority of people whose votes are trying to be suppressed are people who are the most climate alarmed for obvious reasons. So we both do them a disservice to not fight hard for their right and their access to voting, but we also leave an important constituency who is promoting this work. And finally, reach out to elected officials on whatever side of the aisle they are and hold their feet to the fire to whatever climate ambitious statements they make, and make sure they deliver on their promises. And yes, finally, vote.
100%. Absolutely. And thank you both so much. I think having a really concrete framework like this, with the great examples of the work you're doing locally, hopefully can inspire folks. So if you're not already connected to a local organization like FACS or JCAN New York, find one in your area. Again, there are 40 state chapters of Interfaith Power and Light around the country. There are more hyper local organizations like FACS working in a handful of counties in Northern Virginia. But if there isn't a faith-based organization, certainly there are other environmental groups like Meg and Jeff have both alluded to. So just diving in again, even a little bit deeper, one question we hear a lot is the fact that we need to be engaging more young people in this work. And I think any young people listening want to ask us to engage them more. And so, how are you approaching this? Maybe if you can reflect on how you're currently working with young people, or any ideas or questions that you would pose to the audience who are considering the same. Jeff, do you want to kick us off here?
Absolutely. It's a big issue for us at JCAN. And while we do have a fair number of young people, I would say we skew towards people who might identify as young, but who are collecting Social Security and riding the subway for half price. So we need them all. And I think it's a mission of ours for the coming year or two to invite more youth into the work that we do. And we need them. They supply an enormous amount of energy and urgency, of course, because it is the only world that they have ever known, the facing of climate peril. And they bring an enormous amount of energy, enormous amount of skills, and that urgency. So we need them. Why is it difficult? Well, just statistically, we know that people's affiliation with religious institutions has waned. Their identification as religious people has waned. And so the youth out there are more inclined to affiliate in high numbers with the more secular organizations. Sunrise, of course, is the most prominent among them, but there are others. 0 Hour is another one that comes to mind. And so that's great when they do that. And of course, Meg and I are both saying that the faith communities have a huge amount to offer, both the people in the organizations and the work that we offer. So I think it's important work, and the modeling that we've done in our work with Green Faith and our own sort of depth of our own religious sensibilities will be appealing overall, even to the more orthodox parts of our community who tend to be even less involved, because we need them all. And in a way, I could argue they need us too. It's all hands on deck.
All hands on deck. Meg, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I mean, I agree with so much of what Jeff said, and we definitely skew to that same market. But I mean, as Jeff said, we do need all hands on deck, and it probably will involve some change in our models, like tweaking our model. But I think it's natural to work with the youth groups of the faith communities with which we engage in, and I think it's so relevant, and they really will be able to identify, and we do, and we need them. So with something also on the table for us to prioritize and do better, and also partner with the youth-led groups that are out there right now. There's some really great ones, and so forging those partnerships as well.
Absolutely.
Could I piggyback on what you said, Meg? Because I think you raised a huge point, which is the idea of examining the models by which our organizations are structured, and maybe they just don't work for a younger generation, at least not completely, at least not in the same way. Maybe less meetings, more activities, more social connectivity. We don't have the sweet spot or the special sauce yet, but I think being willing to examine your model is an appropriate wisdom and humility. So I just wanted to underscore that.
Absolutely. So we had a question come in that was talking about interfaith projects and opportunities. And I know, Meg, in particular, you are an interfaith organization. And Jeff, I know you work in an interfaith manner with other organizations. So what would you recommend to faith communities listening today in terms of working in an interfaith manner? And then are there specific examples of projects that if someone's listening in New York or in Northern Virginia that they can get involved in?
Yeah, so most faith communities are natural collaborators. They're working together on community issues like homelessness and food insecurity and other ministries. So, I mean, my recommendation is to learn what faith communities your organization is already working with, and consider how those issues intersect on climate. So for instance, what would a joint discussion look like on climate and racial justice? If you don't know where to start, I recommend speaking with your religious leader or your local interfaith group, and just start by building relationship. I mean, we have seen examples of that certainly in Northern Virginia, where there's been we've seen partnerships between, one of the largest Jewish synagogues in the area and a mosque, and they will, come together with some frequency around a particular topic. So these conversations are happening, and I think what it really is about, being open for that long-term relationship and a long-term dialogue. So that's my recommendation.
Jeff, how about you?
I think that, I was just distracted by a question I saw come into the chat that I wanted to jump on, but I don't want to move you away from what you were focused on. Would you repeat the question that you wanted me to respond to?
Sure, or feel free to jump in. But the original question was, someone had asked about interfaith projects and opportunities to get involved. And this person is actually in New York. So if there are any projects or opportunities you wanted to share, and then dive in, share,
Yeah. Well, the March 11th Green Faith-led program that was global was a perfect example of trying to mobilize on the largest scale possible the faith communities around the world. And so they'll be taking next steps, which I would underscore and invite people to check out, because they do powerful work and they're really great at growing small communities that can connect with larger communities, that connect with global communities, and really help us feel that's the sense of numbers and coordination that I think is pretty powerful.
And yeah, feel free to
dive
in.
this
Let's
numbers.
go ahead.
This question was, is there a need for a single umbrella group to facilitate collective action? And is there a viable candidate to fill that role? So I can speak to what goes on in New York State. And New York State is a particular location. It's disproportionately influential policy that we have worked on at the state level in New York has then gone on to be a model for a lot of what is in the Green New Deal and for a lot of what the Biden administration is now pushing right now. So we're in a special scenario. But what JCAN does a lot is work within larger coalitions. So you can have your own organization. It could be a faith organization. It could even be a small faith organization. But when you are then feeding into people who are already doing the work, are already doing the organization, then you really sort of create more ripples. You multiply their efficacy without having to waste time recreating the wheel and working too much in parallel when you could be working coordination with. Having said that, though, there is a model called the Flotilla Model, which is multiple organizations, right? Multiple boats. We're all sailing in the same direction. And there are so many areas that need to have work done. So if one group is kind of carving out, we're river keepers, we want to protect the health of this particular ecosystem. Great, have an organization that does that. You're in the flotilla. If you want to be joining at the macro level, then join a coalition, but have your own organization that brings more people into that and feeds through you into that coalition work. So I don't think there's ever going to be one organization that's an umbrella organization, because I think there's so much work to be done, and the specialization that people passionate about particular things can bring is completely priceless.
Meg, did you have any thoughts you wanted to share on that in particular?
Yeah, it's a question that we get as well. I mean, the environmental movement could be criticized as being fragmented, but I tend to lean more toward the way Jeff described it, which is that, you know, we all do bring something different and unique, and um, I haven't seen the need being fulfilled yet. So long as there's more need, my feeling is that the more groups that are out there, the better. We haven't solved this problem yet. So, and as far as coordination, right, there's so many different levels of coordination. Facts and our level of work is so specific to the local jurisdiction that there are some things that make sense to collaborate on. I mean, our net zero program, for instance, has no geographical boundaries. However, our advocacy is extremely specific to our local jurisdiction. So with that in mind, there's all partnerships that make sense at a variety of levels. So absolutely, you don't want to be operating in a bubble, and you need to forge those partnerships and relationships that make sense.
And that's something that I talk about a lot here on the webcast and in most presentations I give, which is really helping people outside of the faith sector understand that the faith sector cares about this, that people are doing really powerful and incredible work, that the work around faith and climate can be a refuge for people who are looking for support and to be empowered and inspired, as Jeff was mentioning. And that, you know, it's not about asking people to join our faith in order to work with us. It's about the fact that we are passionate people who do feel deeply called to do this work and want to bring our gifts and talents and resources forward. And so, you know, encouraging anyone listening who may be, you know, not a person of faith, just to think of the great work that's being done. I mean, these are two great examples, and that, you know, we want to partner with you. We want to talk to you. We want to coordinate. So let's keep going with the audience Q&A. There's some great questions coming in. I wanted to go to a question from Lori in Erie, Pennsylvania, who's asking for ideas about how to find grants and financing and funding for congregations to do things like going solar or pesticide free or putting in permeable parking lots, any kind of other eco-friendly materials. And before I turn to our guests, I do just want to plug two partnerships that Blessed Tomorrow has, one of which is called Unity, which is an online financing marketplace for congregations to look for financing for not just sustainable projects, but potentially other financing needs. And it's very specifically tailored to the faith sector. The second is we have a partnership with Arcadia Power, which can allow individuals, but also congregations to go 100% clean energy, you know, regardless of what's available in your local community. And you can learn more about that on the Blessed Tomorrow website. But let's turn it over, Meg or Jeff. How do you help people? It's so local. It's so specific to where you live. I'm sure you get these questions a lot.
Well, I can have a go at this, Jeff, and agree. It is completely local, and so we do get a lot of these questions, and faith communities are also structured so differently that, you know, in some instances, it's for instance, for funding solar panels, a faith community may decide to just purchase the panels outright through a capital campaign and find it the simplest way to get the job done. There's funding opportunities depending on if your locality has enabled this, such as CPACE, commercially property assessed clean energy, which is a way of financing clean energy projects. In Northern Virginia, there's some opportunities through Northern Virginia Soil and Water District that fund energy and also watershed projects. You know, we're always tracking and on the lookout for grants. I haven't, you know, I'm sort of watching and hopeful that some will trickle down now. And one thing, for instance, that FACTS is working on is the establishment of a green bank, and which could provide funding in this area. And so I'm happy to say that we successfully advocated for that enabling legislation in the 2021 Virginia General Assembly. So Fairfax County is now analyzing that. And so that could be a way of funding some of this work in the future. So we're going to keep an eye on that.
Congratulations on that success. Jeff, how about you? How do you respond when folks are asking these kinds of questions?
Well, because we work within the Jewish community, our resources tend to be there. And there are organizations, one called Hazon, which is the largest Jewish environmental organization in the country. They have a program called the Seal of Sustainability. So they're not necessarily in the grant writing business, but they're in helping organizations, synagogues, Jewish community centers to figure out what they can do, what is possible, work with them to see what their ambitions are around sustainability, and then create a program that has markers for them so that they can track their progress, can reach out to resources, which may very well include finding options for grants. I'm just not personally aware of that. So they're a terrific resource, and there's a waiting list for people to get into that program. There's also our sister organization, JCAN Massachusetts, that does their own benchmarking of synagogues and helps them to also monitor their own footprint, which then again might include grant proposals and such.
Thanks. We had another question come in from a couple of folks, actually. Dennis in Pennsylvania, Ron in Wisconsin, and I'm sure it might be on other people's minds, which is, what's the best legislative strategy for reducing carbon emissions in the US? And, how do we assess these kinds of policies that come forward? There's many out there. ecoAmerica, as a 501c3, we don't take a formal stance on specific legislation, but if you look at our momentous statement, for example, we're clearly calling for ambitious climate solutions. But I'm curious how you both, in your local and state advocacy, how you approach kind of assessing how you're going to advocate and what you're going to advocate for.
I could take a whack at that, and it is a complicated issue. But I would say in the broadest terms, despite the ambitious statements of a number of corporations, I remain somewhat skeptical about capitalist America's ability to solve this problem, or their will to take the lead and be held accountable to do so. So I get most excited and optimistic when I think of bold, sweeping law change. I think we need to change the laws of this country, which will change the inequities involved, which avoids greenwashing and really puts policy that is bound by law into place. And that when policies happen and people see that all of our lives are benefited by it, then I think that's when we're going to see some of the diminishing of the partisan divide. But if you say, let private sector do it, let the government do it, I think the government's got to do it, which is why I'm so excited about the the bills that are about to be proposed currently by the Biden administration.
Meg?
And yeah, I'll just add, so FACS works, as I mentioned before, at the local and state level, in so much as that Virginia is a Dillon rule state, meaning that the localities are bound by legislation that's tied up at the state level. So where we identify a barrier, we may decide to advocate for change at the state level as well. FACS's advocacy work is decentralized through our advocacy teams. We have really worked to establish a network of issue leads so that we are smart on the subjects, and the issue leads feed and inform our decision making. And we really go through a process. In fact, we're about to launch into the next iteration of that process of soliciting feedback on the issues. So it's really a marriage of what we see as the biggest areas of opportunity, and going back to that, where's the passion of our group of activists, and matching those up and then thirdly, matching that against the capacity of our organization, where we think we can be most impactful given our capacity. So that's how we approach it, and we come up with our top. Well, we had 11 this year, but it's not going to be 11 moving forward. Maybe our top 5 or 6 advocacy priorities, and we turn those into talking points and have a consistent messaging that our advocacy teams then use, which we have found has been really effective.
So Meg, I know you talked about the advocacy you did with CPACE and with the Green Bank. And Jeff, I'm curious if there are some specific examples of the kinds of policies that you've been advocating for through JCAN at the state level in New York or the local level. Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry. In 2019, New York State passed a bill called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and that would bring New York State to 100% renewable energy by 2050, but hopefully well before that, bring thousands of good green jobs to the state, and really prioritize frontline communities. So that was a huge, long fought for victory, and again, has been a model for national policy that's upcoming now. We've just had a bill introduced into the state legislature called the Climate and Community Investment Act, which is the funding mechanism for the previous bill, which was passed with the intention of then following up with the funding mechanism. So now we're fighting that war. But that's why I say sort of the big sweeping kinds of legislation, we have to think big. We don't have time for small piecemeal legislation that would have us, in line to lose the sprint side of what is both a sprint and a marathon. Like we really have to go very fast because the timelines are very short.
Just why every voice matters, right? And we're all needed. So I wanted to read one last question here, and then we can start to wrap up. We're at the end of our time. But Cameron from Pennsylvania asked, are there any updates on where American evangelicals in the broadest definition are with climate change and earth care advocacy? And so I'm not sure how much either of you work with the evangelical community. I'll just share that, I encourage folks to check out the incredible work that's being done by the Evangelical Environmental Network and their Young Evangelicals for Climate Action network, the World Evangelical Alliance's Creation Care program, with the changes, and the federal administration is really kind of ramping back up with some new and exciting programs and projects. So if you're not following Evangelical Environmental Network, the Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, and the World Evangelical Alliance's Creation Care programs, I would encourage you to do so. But do either of you, Meg, do you work with the evangelical community very much?
I mean, we have connected with the Young Evangelicals group. I would say within our network of more active faith communities, I'm not certain that any would necessarily identify themselves as evangelical. We are absolutely wide open to working with every single faith community that exists. So we'd love to be working with them, and we do hope that as there is increasing cover for some of these groups, that they, you know, will feel comfortable and aligned with our work. So it is a group that we seek to reach more deeply.
I think all of us would like to work more deeply with as many folks as we can. And I would just plug anyone who's listening. The American Climate Leadership Summit, our annual conference, is coming up at the end of April. And there is a faith forum, a national climate faith forum that we're hosting the first day in the afternoon on April 27th. And we're going to be hearing from Kyle Mayer-Chop, who is the executive vice president with Evangelical Environmental Network, and actually was the founder and spokesperson for Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. So if you want to hear directly from that community, I would encourage you to join us on April 27th. All right, we are at the end of our time. So I just want to say thank you so much to Jeff and Meg for joining us as our guests, for all of your incredible work. And I'm glad the two of you connected. And so the more that all of these local organizations can connect with each other and kind of learn together, I think, again, we'll join that flotilla if we're not already.
Yeah.
So in addition to the 5 things that Meg and Jeff encouraged you in, I would also invite you all to sign the momentous statement from ecoAmerica, from our coalition. Again, it calls for ambitious climate solutions that halve carbon emissions going forward each decade and is centered in justice. And it's a cross-sector statement meant to demonstrate broad support for this kind of bold action. So you can sign by going to ecoamerica.org and adding your name. And for all of our listeners, please click on the link to the survey when this webcast ends to provide your feedback. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can check out the description below to let us know what you think. Engage with us online with the hashtag Let's Talk Climate, and be sure to subscribe and follow us for the latest thought leadership resources and episodes on climate action and advocacy. And also, if you missed our last episode, it was really fantastic, where we talked about the faith role in addressing climate anxiety and eco-grief. So you can check that out on ecoAmerica's YouTube channel. And as I mentioned, we invite you all to join us at the 10th Annual American Climate Leadership Summit. Again, it's being held April 27th through the 29th. That National Faith and Climate Forum is on the afternoon of the 27th, and we're hearing from some really powerful speakers, including our keynote, who is civil rights leader and environmental activist, the Reverend Dr. Benjamin Chavez. So you can register today at acls2021.org, and make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter so you can get the latest information and updates on that as speakers are confirmed. So we're so glad you're here. Thank you. Your passion is important. Your commitment is needed. Join the flotilla or encourage others to do that. And we are with you. We support you. And we will see you next week. Thanks, everyone.